and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this UWA Hong Kong Alumni Network webinar, Mental Health in Times of Transition and Change. Thank you for joining us from Hong Kong and everywhere else across the globe as well. The University of Western Australia acknowledges the custodians and traditional owners of the land on which our campuses are located. At the main campus, Crawley, where I'm speaking to you from today, the university acknowledges the Whadjuk Noongar people as the traditional owners of the land on which it is situated. The Whadjuk Noongar remain the spiritual and cultural custodians of their land and continue to practice their values, language, beliefs, and knowledge. As the Associate Director of Alumni and Community here at UWA, I'm personally committed to supporting our global alumni community. COVID-19 has impacted our global alumni community, and events like this webinar provide a really great opportunity to connect our graduates with the university and also with each other. Now, today's topic is of particular interest as COVID-19 has forever changed not only the way we work, but also the impact on our mental health, and it's really brought that to light. Today's much more than an event as well. It's about building the community and connecting alumni with each other. I'm really looking forward to hearing from the panelists shortly, and I'll be back at the end after the Q&A with a few final closing remarks. But for now, I'd like to introduce UWA Alumni Hong Kong Ambassador, Dr. Andrew Stock, who's the Director of and Clinical Psychologist at ClinPsych Services. Andrew, over to you.
Thank you, Kieran, for that warm welcome. It's great to be here. I can see that we've had some attendees join us already, and so really looking forward, as Kieran said, to having a chat today, exploring this issue of mental health and how we're transitioning and continuing to learn and evolve in the current climate that we find ourselves in, whether that's in Hong Kong, where the clinical practice that I run is situated, or whether it's here in Perth in Western Australia, which is where I am currently physically located and sadly unable to visit Hong Kong for the past 18 months as this pandemic has continued to continue. Of course, interestingly, whether I was in Western Australia or in Hong Kong, in terms of comparing with other parts of the globe, actually two areas where things have been managed quite, I guess, successfully, if you might say it that way, in terms of not being widespread infection, and in terms of quality of life, perhaps not bad compared to other parts of the globe. And so some interesting things to explore from different perspectives. I'm really excited to be here, not only to connect with you all, but also to remind you about the wonderful group of alumni from the University of Western Australia in Hong Kong. I first joined the alumni committee many years ago, and we're headed up by my friend Ricky Mui and a number of other wonderful committee members. Ricky might even be here today, actually. And obviously over the past 18 months, it's been difficult to engage in the typical activities that we like to do as an alumni group. I know there was a recent event that occurred in Hong Kong, and it was great to see some people smiling, getting together, and really connecting around that. So we're going to continue to try to find great ways to connect with all of the wonderful UWA alumni in Hong Kong. And we're very, very pleased to be here today to provide this particular webinar. I'm very pleased and honored to be your moderator for today and to introduce our wonderful panel. Let me start by introducing Dr. Carmela Pestell. Great to have you here today, Dr. Pestell.
Thanks, Andrew.
Dr. Pestell is a clinician, lecturer, and researcher who's worked as a clinical psychologist and a neuropsychologist for over 20 years. She's been the director of the Robin Winkler Clinic in the School of Psychological Science since 2013. Funnily enough, just a few years after I graduated from the University of Western Australia with my honours in psychology. Dr. Pestell oversees the internal practicum for postgraduate trainees in clinical psychology and neuropsychology, and also co-led the development of a new graduate certificate in FASD at UWA. That's fetal alcohol syndrome, I believe. Her career commenced as a clinician in child and adolescent mental health services before holding several positions at the direct level within the Health Department of Western Australia. This included being the director of the Neurosciences Unit for 14 years. She's a fellow of the Australian Psychological Society and current treasurer of the WA College of Clinical Neuropsychologists. Dr. Pestell's research investigates the neuropsychological implications of neurodevelopmental disorders and brain injury and concussion across clinical and forensic settings, a very important area of research that has the potential to improve assessment, diagnosis, and treatment. So wonderful to have Dr. Pestell with us. I'd also like to introduce the other wonderful members of our panel. Jacqueline Tiao. Over the last 25 years, Jacqueline has held several C-level positions globally in the telecommunications, media, and entertainment industries. As Chief Digital Officer of HGC, she's responsible for transformation technology, cybersecurity, data and digital capabilities for customers and internal staff. Throughout her career, Jackie's been a key driver in creating industry game changers and shifting the paradigms for her customers. Jackie, wonderful to have you here today.
Thank you very much. Very honored to be on this panel today.
Great. Last but not least, I'd like to introduce Josh Sims. Josh has worked in the relocation industry for 20 years. He graduated from UWA in 2011, a couple of years after me, and has worked from the ground up, originally relocated to Singapore from Perth in 2014, and then took on a new challenge at a very interesting time in Hong Kong in 2020. So he's been based in Asia for 7 years now. Josh has got a very important job that's happening at a very interesting time, and obviously very much is aware of what's going on in Hong Kong at the moment. And so it's great to have you here with us as well, Josh.
Thanks, Andrew. Pleasure.
Okay, wonderful. All right, folks. Well, before we jump into our panel discussion, I wanted just to remind everyone that we're talking about mental health today. And for any of you who might feel as though any of the discussion brings up a level of distress to the point where you're even not feeling safe, then we're going to share a resource with you that's available through Mind Hong Kong, who are a wonderful organization in Hong Kong who are able to point you in the direction of support services if you're having any emotional or psychological challenges and you feel the need that you need to access some help. Of course, if it is an emergency, we'd encourage you to dial 999, but otherwise we hope that that helps to point you and anyone else you can think of who might be needing some support in the right direction. Jackie, I'd like to pivot back to you now and kick off our conversation.
Sure.
This COVID-19 outbreak, it's really posed significant and ongoing challenges to the worldwide economy and people's daily lives. And it continues to have far-reaching consequences beyond just the physical spread of the virus. Jackie, how have you found that adapting to the crisis has necessitated even more creativity and innovation in a place in the world, Hong Kong, that we know is already quite renowned for its innovation and creativity?
That's right. Thanks very much for the introduction. It's very kind indeed. And welcome, everybody. I'm glad everybody could join today. I think we've been very lucky in Hong Kong, and that you're quite right. We've tended to be quite innovative in the worst of times, and now with COVID on our doorstep, I think we've had to pull out quite a few other tricks out of the bag. I think what I see, well, HGC services all segments of the market, right? So we look at consumer, we look at the small, medium enterprise, and we look at large enterprise. And I think what I observe is an acceleration of adapting to to things quickly. And you'll find that in particular, I'll talk about Hong Kong in particular, you'll find that in particular, Hong Kong has always been very quick to adapt. So if you look back, and when we had SARS, for example, we had the avian flu, et cetera, et cetera. Hong Kong as an economy, as a community, has always been very quick to adapt. I think what surprised us is some of the innovation that has come out of adapting to this, what we're calling the new normal. So I'll give you an example. A lot of people ask me in what I do, why do you not move into more self-service? And it's because in the consumer market, or in the large mass market, people actually like to call us. So even if I gave you a self-service function, I would always have people on the phone. And what we found was that during COVID, for example, our call volumes actually went up. And we actually had to put more people on the phone. I think part of it had to do with the fact that, this social distancing, this isolation at home, lack of social contact was prompting a lot of people to actually make more phone calls. It wasn't just us. So where we got a lot of demand from was actually our mid-market segment and our large enterprise. And we were actually asked to come help with solutions, help with more capacity, etc. We said, what's going on? And we found that not just ourselves, but amongst our customers and our customers' customers, they were all getting more people dial in, call in, transact more. They were chatting online more to organizations. So this is outside and above, them chatting with their own friends. And some of the more innovative solutions we've had is actually enabling what would seem to people as normal conversations now. And I find that quite fascinating. It's like they've actually moved from one type of conversation to a whole other world of conversations for themselves. And that's quite fascinating about Hong Kong.
Absolutely it is. And Jackie, I love what you had to share about getting on the phone, right? It's an interesting situation that we find ourselves in. I know I talk to a lot of my clients about Zoom fatigue, which is an interesting thing to bring up as we're on a Zoom meeting as we speak. And yet there's something actually quite, I guess, nice about an old-fashioned phone call as a way of connecting. Right. At the end of the day, whether we're dealing in business or in healthcare or whatever the case may be, we're working with people. And I find that so interesting that the old-fashioned phone call really had a renaissance during that period, and it was a way to connect.
That's right. And the innovation comes in from just taking a whole lot more of them, finding new levels of service, finding new types of services people are actually looking for. A lot of companies have actually asked us to enhance, for example, use AI to enhance a lot of the chatbots and the chat solutions that they have, because they needed it to be more natural, like people were actually talking to real people. And I know it sounds weird, but I think a lot of our customers actually find that very comforting. I don't think they really mind that they're talking to robotics at the back. I think they find it very comforting that it sounds and feels like a real person at the back. Yeah.
How interesting. How interesting. I want to throw over to you quickly, Josh. Have you been on the phone more?
Yeah, I was just about to make a comment about that. Probably two things. My team every day tell me that they spend much more time on the phone. Probably a lot to do more with the complexity of relocating at the moment, but also I think people are a little bit more willing to share these days about what they're feeling and how they're actually going and the reasons for their move. Whereas before, it was always just kind of moving for work. Now I'm actually making a move because of my family or how I'm feeling or, and how we're going as a family unit. So yeah, my team tell me every day, Josh, we might be doing the same amount of revenue or something like that, but we're spending way more time on the phone. So yeah, another complication for us.
How interesting. Dr. Pestell, you're the clinical director at the Winkler Clinic, and here in WA we haven't had as many lockdowns, as many restrictions, but has there been an uptake and an uptick in learning more about utilizing technologies, telehealth and etc.?
Absolutely. And even though we haven't had an extended quarantine or a high number of cases. I think that mental health issues have still impacted on people here. We've seen a huge upsurge in the demand for psychological services, and also telehealth as well has been very popular too. And so we've had to train up our practitioners to get used to that type of medium.
How interesting. I've certainly recognized a similar uptick in demand for services in Hong Kong. I think at most places in the world that would be the case. Very interesting to hear. Josh, I'm going to come back to you now and to talk a little bit more about, you know, even though the fact that there is a pandemic going on, research seems to be suggesting that workers are still willing to relocate. So how has the onset of flexible work arrangements influenced this, and what impact on mental health have you seen on people moving or perhaps finding it a little bit more difficult to move? The topic of a lot of those conversations on the phone, perhaps, in Hong Kong and APAC.
Yeah, so I suppose there's a few kind of dynamics to it. People are moving, but we're seeing a lot of one-way movement. So like I was kind of referencing before, people are moving because they're going back home. So you take Hong Kong as an example. A lot of expats are calling it earlier on their assignments, or so whereas you might be finishing or planning to leave in a year from now because you might have been separated for a year or a year plus, you're deciding to go earlier. So we're seeing a lot of that. But in terms of flexible work arrangements, they kind of don't go so hand in hand with mobility because, you know, tax and compliance is a big part of what we do. So you can't necessarily always work in one country, be paid in another country. And we have seen a lot of companies actually mandate you can't work in another country unless, as a blanket rule, and only have special approvals. You know, so you could think, okay, whilst I'm a resident of Hong Kong, I'll go back to Australia whilst this blows over and continue to work from there. But, you know, once you spend 90 days in Australia, you should be paying tax there, and you'll be paying tax in Hong Kong as well. So, you know, you can imagine for organizations that have, you know, upwards of 50,000 employees around the globe, managing that part is quite difficult. So yeah, I mean, on the one-way movements as well, out of Hong Kong, we've been seeing a lot of local Hong Kongers relocating, which is not a new market for us, as Hong Kong people have, you know, traditionally always left Hong Kong for other countries to immigrate for, you know, usually for education of their kids or a different lifestyle. But the political kind of issues that came about through the national security legislation brought out in June last year kind of really complicated things. So we saw a lot of people start moving almost immediately. You know, we altered our keyword searches. We made sure we had advertisements in Cantonese to attract that market, and it kind of paid dividends really quickly. And, you know, the markets of Australia, UK, especially with the new B&O regulations that have come in, making it easy for people to relocate there, means a lot of people have been taking it up. So previously, if a Hong Konger wanted to move to another country and become a resident, they often would pay as a kind of investment visa, upwards of €1 million or whatever it might be. Now it's about £500 for you and your family to kind of go through the visa requirements in the UK under the B&O program. So that's kind of a new market for us, so to speak. So then on the mental health side of things, yeah, I definitely won't want to comment too much, not being a professional in that realm. So I'll just kind of share what I see and maybe some personal parts of it. You know, separation and uncertainty, of course, right? You know, Hong Kong, if we take the Hong Kong Australia lane, I'm from Perth, of course, but work in Hong Kong, two of the most strictly controlled areas in the world, and both with the COVID zero approach right now. So that doesn't bode well necessarily for making movement easier later on. So I definitely feel like I'm stuck here. And the only way out for me would be, and my family, would be to either have a job back in Australia or leave our jobs and relocate permanently home. So I think I'm not the only one in that boat. I think many people are dealing with that. Hong Kong also had mandated quarantine camps for close contacts and contacts of close contacts. Families, that was a massive stress. You know, if you were at work and you were a close contact to a colleague, and you were put into a quarantine camp, if you had young children, they would have to come with you. So I think that played had a massive issue on people leaving, because they were too scared to go through that or put their family through those things. I think Hong Kong is leaving their country of birth, and kind of the sadness about what Hong Kong might become afterwards has a big factor in it too. What influence the Chinese education system will have in 10 or 20 years when their kids will have gone through it. They're very concerned about that. So that's the biggest driving factor we've seen for people, and Hong Kong is leaving, recently in the last 6 months. And I could probably foresee that to continue in a steady trickle, not even a trickle, but a steady flow for the next 5-6 years until we have a bit of a better idea of what's actually happening here.
Josh, you're not wrong. Plenty of sources of uncertainty, and then for so many people that leads to sort of an ongoing sense of anxiety, and perhaps I think also I heard in your sharing personally, and I appreciate that, a bit of a sense of feeling trapped and feeling really unsure about what the future will hold. And so I think a lot of people in Hong Kong, a lot of people around the globe are experiencing that to some extent. Before I jump to Dr. Pestell to speak more specifically to some of the mental health considerations, I want to go back to you, Jackie, just to ask a little bit about, at the organizational level, have you noticed any ways in which we're trying to meet some of these needs that are coming up for employees, for teams, as they're dealing with uncertainty and change?
Yeah, I think a lot of companies have, at the organizational level, we see a lot of different types of strategies. And if you look at, say, for example, some of the multinationals, some of the big banks, ever since the start of COVID, they've mandated stay at home or remote working. And there's a lot of people that they haven't been able to either travel into region, or they haven't been able to travel back to HQ, but definitely remote working. And there's been a massive adaptation to that because, as you know, with highly regulated industries, a lot of the data cannot be sourced outside an organization. So people have had to adapt, and a lot of organizations have had to adapt. We're talking about banks, financial services, insurance. They simply cannot access customers' information outside a closed system. So there's only so many things they can actually access remotely. So we found that people have had to adapt. They've had to create certain spaces for employees to either be back on site. They've had to adapt their systems. They've had to adapt their processes, for example, to allow, say, your account managers, your wealth managers, your private banking. That's a huge industry in Hong Kong, to access the customers' information and actually service their customers while remote working. Then if you think about things like, for example, the other big industry we have here is retail, for example. A lot of retail, admittedly, has moved online. But what's surprising about Hong Kong's not traditionally an e-commerce online type of economy. It's not like you would see in Australia or the US, for example. And although that had been pre-COVID slowly growing, we found that it wasn't actually growing that fast. So the people are going online. They're going on to the big Chinese retailers, for example, so the Taiwan, the AliExpress, and places like that. But in terms of, say, mid-market, or how say, for example, how the US or Europe has adapted, where a lot of organizations actually took their products and services and went online during the pandemic and actually did very well out of it. We found that in Hong Kong enterprise, there was a desire for the enterprise side to move online, but that demand for that wasn't shared on the consumer side, if you like. And we found that really quite peculiar, if you like. And we found that what people missed was literally Hong Kong being a very social animal. People missed actually going out, having a meal, walking down the malls, and just walking down the streets and doing things like that. And I think they missed that element. The online side has grown and people have adapted to it, and you know, Hong Kong TV Mall, for example, first profit in 5 years of operations. And when you get something like that, I mean, Amazon took almost 15 years before it made a profit. And a lot of the similar type organizations pre-COVID was actually projecting similar type of numbers. And you look at Hong Kong TV Mall, you know, I'm going to say a significant part due to the pandemic made a profit within 5 years of operations, which is really quite impressive for an online mall. In things like, for example, service industries, you know, travel, hospitality, and things like that, I think you'd find that as much as at the start of COVID, there was a massive downturn, and you know, the airlines are still really in a world of hurt. They've actually come out and accelerated a lot of their digital transformations and how they've thought about going digital. And you know, you look at you look at the government's push, for example, staycations. You can't go on a vacation, but have staycations. We have the cruises that just go around, you know, Hong Kong, and that gets booked out about 3 months in advance now. And I think they know people are wanting that experience. They know people do need that outlet, and the government's been quite, they've not tried to be as restrictive as other governments, which is quite pleasing. But they've also put a lot of work into working with, especially the SME sector, which tends to be the backbone of our base economy, and also in the mid-market segments, you know, cruises, airlines, hotels, and things like that, and really trying to work with them to bring different types of services. So, you know, the staycation market in Hong Kong is phenomenal. I don't think, you know, people have checked out that many hotels in their life. And if you look at Airbnb now, everybody thought Airbnb would just stop and drop. But if you look at Airbnb now, the number of innovative new experiences and new types of accommodation you can get in Hong Kong is quite amazing. So we see a lot of that coming out of industries. And you know, people are really fighting hard. I think fighting hard to survive in this day and age. And I hear what Josh says about people leaving, and I think it's common knowledge that there was a record number of people that actually migrated. You know, there was a net migration out of Hong Kong this year. But if you look at the people that would stay, it's like any other country, right? You will have the nets that will stay in Hong Kong, and at some point in time, the Hong Kong economy has always bounced back. About, I think we tracked it, and the Hong Kong economy tends to drop, but it bounces back by a factor of about 3 to 4x each time something like that happens. And we track this, and I think it's available on the government websites as well. We track this all the way from the Korean War, actually, until now. So 1950 until now. And we said over a period of 50 years, how has the Hong Kong economy actually bounced back? And every time something external affects Hong Kong, we found that the bounce back or the growth rate on Hong Kong and the bounce back was about 3 to 4x. So the COVID effect actually has been the same. So Jackie, we're finding industries really growing.
That is so interesting. And, you know, 70 years of data to sort of back up this. And what I loved about what you shared was a reminder of the wonderful stubbornness of Hong Kongers to say, this is important to us. This is important to our health and well-being, to be able to get out of our small apartments, to connect, to shop, to eat, and how that's an important part of culture. And also, as you said, the bouncing back, the resilience that's part of that. And so part of that is looking for those important things in our lives, what we value the most.
That's right. From
a day-to-day perspective. The other aspect, I think, is really recognizing that it has been a challenging time for the city for many different reasons. And Dr. Pestell, before I ask you a little bit more about some of those impacts, just in general for all human beings, really, of uncertainty and how that impacts us, I want to selfishly ask a little bit more about your research first. I noticed that you're interested in FASD, and it was actually in Hong Kong where I attended a workshop just before the pandemic set in, that I learned a lot about the updated research on FASD and how that's still at odds with what sort of the general public is aware of in terms of you know, the issue of consumption of alcohol during pregnancy. But I'm just quite interested to hear a little bit more about your research. Selfishly, as the moderator, I'm going to ask that you speak to a little bit about that before we talk a little bit more about COVID-19 and mental health.
Sure. Well, in some ways it is related to the pandemic, because we know that since COVID-19 started, there has been an uptake in the amount of alcohol people are drinking, and I'm also wondering whether there's been an increase in pregnancies as well, with people having not much else to do when they're in quarantine. But researchers around the world are really starting to recognise the toxic effects of alcohol on the growing baby, and I think there's a lot of myths still around that, and a lot of misconceptions too, even amongst you know, medical people with medical backgrounds or clinicians and so on, not really quite understanding the toxic nature of alcohol. And currently the Australian guidelines, NHMRC guidelines, are that no alcohol is safe at all throughout any period of the pregnancy. It's a myth that it's only not okay to drink during the first trimester. It's actually potentially could have consequences, you know, throughout the whole pregnancy, and there is a dose-dependent relationship. So the more alcohol that's drunk, the more likely there are to be a range of effects that can really be permanent and long-term. So it's really important that we get that message of prevention out there without judgment too, because there's a number of reasons why women drink during pregnancy. They're often told that it's okay by their doctor. I was certainly told that when I was pregnant with my daughter. So it can be for a whole host of reasons, and we just need to be, I think, more mindful of that as psychologists and as and family members and community members as well. Yeah. Absolutely.
My partner and I were told the same thing by a medical doctor not too long ago. So there is certainly more and more opportunity to make sure that people are updated about what the research is telling us. So I very much appreciate that. And certainly in the age, I'm aware of that research as well, at least here in Australia, that suggests that there's been a significant increase in the amount of alcohol consumed on a daily basis by Australians, probably as a way of trying to deal, perhaps not in the most adaptive way, with the stress that comes from all the uncertainty and significant change that's been fairly consistent actually across the course of this pandemic. Dr. Pestell, how do these factors tend to influence our mental health?
In many ways, and I'm sure we can all reflect on our own experiences, and we've probably had a different set of reactions to COVID-19, you know, from initial kind of shock and surprise and you know, the roller coaster of emotions that's followed that. And for some people it's been particularly difficult if they've faced more financial pressures. There's just been so many disruptions across so many systems that we interface with, whether it's been the workplace or school or, you know, our own health. People are much more reluctant now to go to hospitals or to seek out medical support. So I think uncertainty is very difficult to deal with from a psychological perspective. We know that one of the factors that makes it particularly difficult for people who are in quarantine is when they don't know when there's going to be an end. I think as humans, we all like to be able to plan ahead and you know, feel like we're moving towards a goal. And there's something about not knowing about the future, and I guess that also brings in the uncertainty around coronavirus. We don't really know how it's going to affect us, the long-term effects of it, whether we're going to contract it. And so that uncertainty is particularly difficult, I think. There's a range of common mental health reactions that we're realising has occurred, and an increase in mood disturbance, people that are more depressed, more anxious, particularly. And we know that there's also, while some people cope better, and it sounds like from what you were saying earlier about Hong Kong as a society, that sounds like it's quite a resilient community in many ways, but there's also sectors of society that do find it more difficult, and they are particularly frontline workers are a particularly vulnerable group because they've got their own fears around infection, and also I guess the worry that they're going to transmit that to family members. I know my daughter's a doctor working in emergency here, and she was very concerned about that when we had that initial outbreak in Perth back in March, and it continues to be an anxiety, I think. There was also a study done last year in Hong Kong, which I thought was interesting, where they surveyed nearly 600 older adults over the age of 60, and found that people who lived alone or who had multiple health conditions were much more likely to have adverse outcomes as well. So I think other vulnerable groups too are people that already have pre-existing mental health conditions, and then that can make, you know, the stress of COVID and the pandemic can actually aggravate those symptoms as well. And even though it sounds like Hong Kong and in many ways WA's been in a similar situation, we haven't had the pressures of extended lockdowns like they have, say, in Melbourne. Yet despite that, there's still been a huge pressure on mental health services, and I think part of it is the uncertainty, but also that disconnection from family and friends, that feeling of being trapped, not being able to go overseas, and that's particularly difficult for international students here or other people that find themselves separated from family and not able to share those significant life events like weddings and funerals, and which is so important as part of that grieving process. And it's almost a compounding factor, I guess, in that, which makes it particularly difficult. Yeah.
Andrew, may I add something to that may be of interest?
Go for it.
So, you know, I love what the doctor is saying. I think here's a thought, right? If you look at some of the fastest growing areas since we started the pandemic, they're mostly, I shouldn't say they're mostly, there are a couple of categories, right? And they're all social categories. One is esports and gaming, right? The second category actually is in dating apps. And one of the fastest growing apps in China is something called Xiao. So I don't know if you guys have heard about it. It's Xiao. It's an AI generated, how should I say? If you've ever watched the movie Her with Scarlett Johansson, it's pretty much like that, right? And it's an AI generated female. And won't go into the details, check it out yourself. But basically, it's for people that are lonely. And it started out targeting men that were lonely because of all the shutdowns, the isolation, the restrictions, et cetera, et cetera. And I think there is a lot of discussion right now on, you know, how people, you know, people's mental health during COVID, right? During COVID. And I think it's a very real issue. I think there are a lot of challenges for a lot of people with the uncertainty, with the isolation, you know, with the lack of social contact, etc. What I think will actually happen is once we actually get out of COVID, you're going to see a whole other range of mental and psychological issues, because of the amount of time people have been spending on things like games, for example. So two categories, right? The first one being games, e-games, esports, any sort of games, the amount of content that is being generated now, gaming content, it's just insane at the moment. And then that second category where people actually believe they are liaising with other people, but they're not. They're actually not. They're AI generated. So you have to wonder what sort of, you know, health issues, mental, physical, and otherwise, would that cause once you come out to another level of normal post-COVID. And I think that is pretty worrying. That is actually very worrying.
Jackie, a really interesting perspective that you've offered there, and very interesting to hear about some of the technological advances that are being part of this adaptation that we're observing. What I'm hearing there is, through all your sharing today, Jackie, is that one thing that's happening is we're rediscovering these seemingly perennial truths about the human experience, and the good old-fashioned connection, even if it's a phone call, goes a long way to really being a protective factor for our mental health. But also, down the other end of the spectrum, there are new and interesting ways to navigate that. There's really an uncertainty, and maybe for some people, there's almost an excitement and some new opportunities to be seen in that. The other thing you mentioned that I can tell you I have clinical experience of is that some people might think that someone who might experience social anxiety has been really a fan of this pandemic, because it's meant that they've had an excuse essentially to stay in their own home and not be faced with that. But what I've found from my clinical experience is, in fact, that as there have been these question marks about reopening and re-engaging, that has set a lot of people who experience social anxiety back, and they feel as though it's really exacerbated their sense of that. And so there is certainly more work to be done, more support to be provided. I want to go back to Dr. Pestell in a minute. But first of all, Josh, you spoke also about your experiences of being in Hong Kong and being disconnected from other friends and family here in Perth because of the very strict border controls that are in place. What has worked for you on the ground in terms of keeping a bit of a sense of your sanity and a sense of feeling generally okay about things? Has it been Airbnb? Has it been staycations? Has it been other approaches?
It's been tough for us. So when I relocated, we had a 5-week-old in tow. So that timing it's kind of like, it is a silver lining, because we've had to have we've had so much time with him as he's been growing up. If I was in the office normally, I would be spending maybe 2 hours a day coming back when he was before bed and things like that. But otherwise, especially at the early parts, I was home for a lot of it. During quarantine was great. So I think for me and my wife, we've used him as our motivation to keep things sane. Hasn't been easy for sure. But he's also the source of a lot of our anxiety in terms of the separation from his family. So unfortunately, he hasn't met anyone that he's related to yet, and he's almost 2. So, and this is not a unique situation. There's many people in this. So, we're talking. I think it was Dr. Pestell mentioned before about maybe how many extra people are creating babies during their time during quarantine and at home. Like there's, I'm sure if that number's gone up, there's people experiencing the same thing. So for us, it's just been a juggling act, so it's both an inspiration for enjoying our time here, but also a source of anxiety for what he's missing out on and what his family's missing out on too, because it goes both ways, I think.
Just, I really appreciate you've highlighted really 2 important things there is, we're not trying to pretend like it's not hard. It's really important to acknowledge that for everyone at some level, there's been sacrifices, there's been a level of grief and loss almost experience for so many of us. But also
turned into a grind, hasn't it? You know what I mean? It was never as fast and over as we thought it would be. It's turned into a long, slow grind that's still ongoing.
Yeah, and there's even a sense of monotony that I've heard from people across the globe. talk about, just it being a grind. That's a really good way to put it. On the other hand, there are things that we can slow down and be grateful for. That might be increased time with family. That might be reduced commute times. A number of things that I've heard anecdotally. Dr. Pestell, from a research perspective, are you aware of any particular things that have proven to be quite helpful in dealing with the anxiety and the stress that comes from the uncertainty and the pandemic?
It's a really good question, Andrew. And you were mentioning before about the grind and almost an avoidance pattern developing. And so what we found is that there has been almost a COVID apathy, I call it, where people have been reluctant to return to work, or it becomes so much harder to go out. And I think that's in part due to the lack of stimulation, just from kind of having the people's world shrinks. And that's particularly the case for those in quarantine as well. So in terms of what's helpful, obviously reaching out to existing mental health services is particularly important. And I know that you've shared some resources, and I think we might have some others online that people can follow up. There has been the advent of a lot more online therapy programs and psychological practices that are now offering this in a way which I think is very positive, because what we found in Australia is that it means that people who are in more rural or remote locations or unable to access therapy because of their family situation or transport issues and so on can now access therapy in a way that they weren't before able to. And Joshua then was kind of implying or talking about his little one and the implications of disrupted attachment or not being able to attach to, I think, important family figures or other people in a child's life. And it just reminded me that there are going to be these long-lasting implications of COVID, mental health implications and other effects that we've talked about that we really don't quite understand now. And that's why I think it's particularly important that if people are finding it difficult to seek help, because we're in for a long haul. It's I don't want to be all doom and gloom about it, but it's going to become a way of life, and the ramifications are ongoing. So, all those usual common sense things we tell our clients in terms of managing stress, reaching out to existing supports. I know there was a study that found that in Hong Kong, what was particularly useful for and built resilience was if families could engage in leisure activities together and engage with their community as well. That's really important. And researchers, particularly at my school at UWA, are very interested in sleep and the effect that good sleep has on improving thinking and emotional regulation and mental health. So it's important that people still get good sleep and eat well and exercise well, and reach out also to people in your life or your neighbour who might be living alone, who might be older, people that are in those vulnerable risk groups, because and hopefully we can destigmatise mental health issues, and maybe that's what I've noticed with COVID. Actually, there's more and even amongst my students, I'm finding they're more willing to talk about their own challenges, and we've seen that with sports figures coming forward and talking about their struggles. And I think that's so important that it becomes part of a usual conversation and doesn't get destigmatized, because that's going to be very helpful as well.
I couldn't agree more, Dr. Pestell. You've just actually reminded me of an initiative that Mind Hong Kong, the organisation that we've shared the link, who can send people in the direction of immediate support if needed, have also just launched an initiative called More Than a Label, and is really sort of exploring the fact that sure, there are these sorts of diagnoses that people who are experiencing mental health, ill health, I should say, might receive, but we all have mental health. And therefore, by its very definition, at some point in our lives, especially I would say during a global pandemic, our mental health might move a little bit along that continuum, and we might experience some level of mental ill health. What a wonderful panel I have the privilege of moderating today. I feel like we could just continue to chat for a long time, but I want to give our wonderful attendees now the opportunity to ask any questions they might have. Now, if you'd just like to jump into the Q&A and share those questions. If you have a question for a specific panelist, please make that known. Otherwise, if it's just a more general question for the panel, I'll be sure to pass it on and see what people have to say about any questions that one of our wonderful 11 attendees have for us today. If there aren't any immediate questions that do come through, then I will make sure to continue to tap the wonderful resources and experience we do have in the room. So even if I'm talking, folks, please feel free to throw something into the Q&A. I'll keep a close eye on that. Josh, where do you see things going to in 2022?
I mean, for us as a business, we're kind of forecasting a little bit of the same. We do expect a bounce back, though, in the second half of next year. A little bit. I'm definitely going to look up what Jackie mentioned before about this 3 times, 4 times bounce back, because my CEO asked me about that quite a lot. And if I can show him some data that gives him some confidence, that would be great. So, I mean, for us, you know, to be successful, we rely on people to be able to relocate globally without issue. Coming into Hong Kong, the numbers are down for immigration by, you know, kind of 80% in across all fields as well. So it's really hampering a lot of the other parts of our business, which is just not moving. It's immigration and apartment searches and things like that. So, you know, we're being conservative. We're going to take advantage, of course, of what's happening with the outbound market that we see, and then just, you know, kind of hope that things do open up a little bit in the second half of next year. I think Hong Kong will have to make a decision at some point, but unfortunately that's dictated and mandated outside of Hong Kong for now, where there's a lot more influence over local decision making. So, you know, for the rest of us waiting, we just have to wait and see when that happens. There's some chat that will happen after the Olympics in February, the Winter Olympics. But, you know, I don't remain too hopeful just yet.
So there's still, I guess, an amount of uncertainty and a wait and see approach, as you said, Josh, and maybe room for a healthy amount of mindfulness, this idea of taking it one day at a time, one moment at a time, actually, even being the present moment. Because, you know, one thing that I think that the pandemic has also done is it's taken away this nice illusion that us human beings have of being in control of things, because in many ways we really aren't. And that's when it's particularly important to think about how can we just focus on the things that are important to us on a daily basis, whether it's a young child that Josh, you and I both have the privilege of experiencing at the moment, or whether it's another aspect. Lisa has tuned into the Q&A and made an interesting point about not only, you know, the fact that it's been quite difficult to communicate with friends and relatives based on the restrictions that have been put in place because of the pandemic. One thing that I worked with a lot as a psychologist in Hong Kong was differing political views within families, and that making conversations a little bit more difficult to have, and how to have difficult conversations. I'm going to put you on the hot seat, Dr. Pestell. How do you have these difficult conversations with family members where there might not be agreements? It might be a political disagreement. It might be differing views about vaccination. How do we navigate these conversations healthily?
It can be incredibly challenging, particularly if somebody has very different views than yourself. And I guess you have to think about what is the ultimate goal, because you can maybe try and convince somebody of your perspective, but if it means that that's going to erode that relationship to the extent that you're no longer talking, you have to weigh up really what is important for you. It's almost, you know, you need to pick your battles, I guess, because we're already under so much stress and there's so much pressure. But you know, I don't think there's any easy answer to that question. It really depends on each person's situation. And you know yourself as a psychologist, there's so many different factors at play, but it's about trying to, I guess, respect other people's points of view and maybe, you know, trying to be diplomatic at times if it means that the consequences of that are going to be far worse. I don't know, I'd be interested in what you think, given that you're working, you know, in the community as well. Sure.
No, I think you do need to be really aware of what you value, what's important to you, and sometimes our values come into conflict, don't they? So we care about our families. We also care about other aspects of our lives and what we think is right, perhaps at a political or a societal level. And so I think trying to honor both those things, but also just recognize that that is a conflict that is going to cause tension within ourselves. And so maybe we come back to this idea of making sure we're trying to look after ourselves. If we're going to go into one of these difficult conversations and we're already stressed and we're not handling that stress well, maybe we're more likely to get a little bit overwhelmed by our emotions. So I agree with you. No easy answers to that question, but certainly trying to look after ourselves and honor what is most important gives us our best shot to deal with them. Jackie, we've got another question that's come through. I am aware of the time, so I'm going to ask for you to do like a 30 or 60 second quick answer to this wonderful question from Ricky, who's asked, as a leader in your business, have you or your company created any initiatives specifically during COVID that have been particularly successful for your staff or customers to help them cope? You're on the clock, Jackie.
100%. Thanks for the question, Ricky. So I was talking previously about e-commerce platforms. One of the things we actually created was not just our own e-commerce platform. We actually created a platform for some of our customers to offer employee rewards programs, because what we found was with a lot of employees remotely working, a lot of the mid-market and smaller companies couldn't afford or couldn't build quick enough employee rewards programs. So, and people didn't want things like, you know, run-of-your-mill Maya vouchers or park and shop vouchers. It was meaningless, and it didn't build a lot of employee engagement. And it's not the same as having, you know, your colleagues around and actually building that sort of attachment to a company. So what we actually did was we created out of our own e-commerce platform the ability for companies to do one-off rewards programs. You know, we really just ran it like an e-commerce loyalty program. If you wanted, you could create, I don't know, UWA vouchers, UWA tokens, for example, and they could be short-lived tokens. They could be very specific to UWA branded stuff, for example. They could be, I don't know, Robert Walters points, for example, you know, that sort of thing. And we found that a lot of our customers, their employees, found that a whole lot more meaningful, and they were more engaged with something that they felt was very personal with the company, right? Rather than just, you know, run of mill, I'm just going to give you, you know, $25 Starbucks vouchers, you know, that sort of thing. People weren't liking, they weren't really getting too attached to those. Yeah. I
hear you, Jackie. It's more personalized instead of, as you said, just a Starbucks voucher, you know, the run-of-the-mill type of, you know, gift that we get for people. Something that has got a little bit more thoughtfulness attached and is about what the company is all about. That is really, really wonderful.
And it also gives them a platform where employees can actually come together. As you said, you get Zoom fatigue, right? And a lot of people were in, you know, you're not going to have virtual drinks every other Friday. You couldn't do that, right? And not a lot, some people want to come out, some people don't want to come out. So they're missing a lot on the aspects of team building. Right now we have restrictions. I think it's maximum 10 or 12 or whatever it is that we have in buildings. So we're finding that we can actually provide a platform for people to come together.
That's wonderful, Jackie. Yeah. That really is wonderful. Perhaps a wonderful theme to finish on, this idea of coming together. Thank you, Jackie. Thank you, Dr. Pestell. Thank you, Josh, for being here today, coming together, working with our attendees. Kieran, over to you to wrap up today. I'm sure we could keep going, but it's been a wonderful opportunity. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew, and thank you to all of you for such a great conversation and sharing your insights and experiences today. I'm sure everyone on the call and those who'll watch the podcast later have really got a lot out of it. So thank you so much for being part of it. I'm sure everyone's giving you a virtual applause as we speak. I just want to encourage everyone to stay connected to the alumni community as well. Utilize your community, keep connected, and remind everyone that we will be sending out a survey about the event today. We want to make sure we're continuing to give you the events and activities that are of interest. So please fill that out and give us your feedback. But until next time, thanks again for joining. Take care and stay safe.